I'd like to welcome you to the Grand Lake Theater here in Oakland for our evening program. We're going to see a video, and then I'm going to come back out and talk a little bit about guns and butter for maybe a minute, and then bring on attorney Mick Harrison, who is the lead attorney for the lawsuit against the FBI and the grand jury petition. So stay tuned for that. Right now we're going to watch about a 10-minute video. In 2006, Thomas Kean and Lee Hamilton, the chair and vice chair respectively of the 9/11 Commission, were guests on C-SPAN's book TV program Afterwards to discuss their book, Without Precedent, the Inside Story of the 9/11 Commission. Thanks to the interviewer having almost certainly not read the book, he asked a few logical questions pertaining to the Commission's access to the alleged 9/11 conspirators then in custody. That those men were being tortured in the CIA's black site prisons was not mentioned at any time during the full interview.
Hello, I'm Marvin Kalb, Senior Fellow at the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard. That's the Kennedy School of Government. I'm here with the co-authors of their new book, Without Precedent, the Inside Story of the 9/11 Commission. And they are Thomas Kean, the former Republican governor from New Jersey, Lee Hamilton, former Democratic congressman from Indiana. They were co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission. Gentlemen, welcome. You were suggesting before also that perhaps the government, when it's in trouble, will set up a commission behind which it can hide.
Yes, all the time, all the time.
There's nothing shockingly new in this story that we've written. I do think, however, there are a lot of subplots on the 9/11. And it's kind of fascinating. For example, one of the stories that has not been told publicly is how we got access, limited access, to the detainees, the people that planned 9/11. That's a hugely interesting story, but for some reason the press just didn't look at it very carefully. The whole period of negotiations between Tom and me on the one hand and the White House on the other. We go into some detail about those negotiations. It's got kind of a behind-the-scenes look, if you would, as to how we got access to documents and to people. So I think it's a fascinating insider's view of the way the Commission operated.
Explain, for example, on access. Do you feel that you got the access that you needed?
I think it's important to point out that in the end we got what we wanted. We had access to every single person we requested to see.
Every sheet of paper that you requested as well?
We got access to all the documents we requested. Now, some of that access, like the Presidential Daily Brief, we had to have access to under fairly restrictive conditions. Access to the detainees was quite restricted, but we felt we got access to the point where we could fulfill our mandate and do what we were supposed to do. Took a lot of doing, but we got it in the end, and I think we felt we had satisfactory access.
Was getting to the detainees the most difficult problem of access that you had?
Yes, I think so in the end. The detainees were key because they included the man who plotted 9/11,
yes,
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and one or two other key operatives. We wanted to see them, and we wanted to see them eye to eye. I had a meeting with George Tenet, who was CIA director. He invited me over for breakfast. And this
they
was
serve good things at the CIA.
They serve a very good breakfast. But the very first sentence out of his mouth was, "Lee, you're not going to see those detainees."
Oh, really?
It was a very sensitive matter for the administration. Interrogating suspects is a complicated business. They do not like people interrupting that process. And so we floated then a lot of ideas. Could we put our people behind a screen? Could we blindfold our people? And some other suggestions. And what we finally decided was, agreed with them, is that we could submit questions in writing to the interrogators, who would then ask the question of the detainee. And we had the system worked out so well that we could immediately have follow-up questions. And in the end, we asked over 1,000 questions, I think, of the detainees.
How many did you actually get?
Of the detainees,
Yeah.
I think 3, but just a handful.
3 is what sticks in my mind.
I think that may be the number. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the key guy.
We got the ones we asked for.
Yeah. But obviously, if you're a long-time investigator, that's not entirely satisfactory, because you like to be able to eyeball the person and judge their reactions.
Right.
But we feel like we got the story. Now you're dealing here with terrorists. So you have a huge problem of credibility. We couldn't talk to any of the 19, they were all dead. So we talked to these fellas, and we tried to judge the credibility with documents and other sources as best we could. But you have a huge question looming as to what's this guy's angle in the back of your mind.
Did you feel as if you got to know their minds a little bit?
I think we did.
Yeah,
I think we did. I think we understood it as well as any. It's important here that the CIA was interrogating those men for a very different purpose than their purpose, the government's purpose, was how do we stop a future attack?
Sure.
Our purpose was not that. Really, our purpose was, as much at least, how did this happen? In other words, we were looking back, government kind of looking forward, to oversimplify it a little bit. And so the perspective is very different here with the interrogators, and that was one reason the administration didn't want us to mess up their interrogation. Now, one other point is important here, and that is all of this was occurring just as Abu Ghraib was happening. And that could have been a factor.
The prison scandal in Iraq.
That's correct. That could have been a factor as well.
At one point, I said something which sort of shook me a bit when we were saying we're trying to get our people in to see them. Somebody said to us, you know, not even the President of the United States knows where all these people are. And I thought, whoa, President ought to know everything. And I don't like that. I hear that.
Did both of you get to actually meet the 3 terrorists?
No.
No.
This was done by staff?
Yes. Yeah, this was done by their staff, because it had to be the same people who were interviewing them on other subjects. We could submit the questions and could submit follow-up questions, but they were the ones who saw them, and they were the ones who...
So was it an eyeball to eyeball?
No, it was not.
Never?
No, it was not.
I'm Bonnie Faulkner. Before I bring out one of our featured speakers this evening, Mick Harrison, I've been asked to say a few words about myself, which I did earlier in the program. But for those of you who weren't here, I do want to mention, of course, that I'm the producer and host of Guns and Butter. It's a weekly 1-hour political economy show. Thank you. And a lot of people that have come up to the table don't realize that I'm still on Pacifica. Guns and Butter airs every morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on Wednesdays on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.9 101.5 FM. It comes on at 6 a.m. California time, and that's streamed live at WBAI.org. And Guns and Butter is still carried on many of the Pacific affiliates, some of which are abroad. So Guns and Butter is still going strong. It's only banned in Berkeley by KPFA. It's been 18 years now, so it's been an 18-year volunteer job, and I thank you so much for all of your incredible support. Thank you very much. I know when we got thrown off the radio, there was a great outpouring of support, which I'm very grateful for. Our featured speaker tonight is Mick Harrison. He is the Director of Litigation for the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. He is a public interest attorney, a graduate summa cum laude of the University of the District of Columbia School of Law. Mick Harrison has a national practice focused on cases that involve whistleblower protection, government accountability, court fraud, and false claims and dangers to public health and the environment. Over the last 25 years, he has worked in partnership on such cases with the Government Accountability Project, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, the Chemical Weapons Working Group, the National Sierra Club, Greenpeace, and Vietnam Veterans organizations, among others. And I also wanted to mention that I did a terrific interview with Mick Harrison and Dave Meiswinkle, the two attorneys for the 9/11 inquiry, along with Richard Gage of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, they're part of the lawsuit. And also Barbara Honecker joined us, who does a lot of research for the Lawyers Committee. It's called FBI Sued for Failure to Provide 9/11 Evidence to Congress, a broad overview of both the lawsuit and the filing of a grand jury petition, the 7 counts of relevant evidence included in the complaint, which also cites the destruction by the FBI of evidence related to the, quote, high fivers. So I would like you to give a very warm welcome to Attorney Mick Harrison, and he will give us the nuts and bolts of the lawsuit against the FBI.
Good evening, folks. So, first of all, I want to thank the Northern California 9/11 group for inviting the Lawyers Committee to have a presence here. We appreciate that. I want to give you a summary of what the Lawyers Committee is doing in terms of litigation on 9/11 and where things stand at the moment. We do have 5 federal court lawsuits pending, active at the moment, 4 in Washington, D.C., and 1 in New York, and I'll explain each of those for you. So before I do that, for those who don't know, and most of you probably do know by now who we are, we're a nonprofit. We are lawyers, but not just lawyers, investigators and others. David Meiswinkle, our executive director, is a lawyer. Ed Asner, our vice president, is not a lawyer. He's an actor. Jane Clark, our treasurer, is a lawyer. Barb Honegger is an investigative reporter, is a board member. Bill Jacoby is a lawyer, and our vice president for organizational development. We also have a board of advisors, which has a number of distinguished lawyers on it with a variety of backgrounds, which is very helpful to us. And we're encouraging other lawyers to come forward and help. So if you know a good lawyer out there, feel free to encourage them to contact us, and we will put them to work on the issues. Before I get into the FBI lawsuit that Bonnie mentioned, let me just say that what the lawyers are trying to do is to apply legal principles and legal procedures to the evidence that's been developed on 9/11 over the last 18 years, including by folks such as Professor David Ray Griffin, chemist Kevin Ryan, physicist Stephen Jones, and we could go down the list. But we're indebted to those folks for laying the groundwork, including the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and Richard Gage. So we're attempting to use that evidence and apply the law to it. And our mission, to make it, I guess, as simple as we can, is transparency and accountability regarding 9/11. So what is the FBI lawsuit? Some of you may not know that there was a second 9/11 commission. Probably all of you know about the 2004 Hamilton-Kean Commission. You just saw something about it. But in 2013 and 2014, the Congress mandated that the FBI create basically a new commission to independently assess all 9/11 evidence not addressed by the original 9/11 Commission. And in fact, a new commission was created. Ed Meese was the chair. And in 2015, in March, a report was issued. The problem is that the congressional mandate that all 9/11 evidence not addressed by the original commission be assessed was not honored by the new commission. In fact, several categories of very significant evidence was simply ignored by the new commission, and those categories of evidence ignored included all the evidence of demolition of the towers in Building 7, the high fibers evidence, which some of you may know about, the evidence of Saudi and other international financing for alleged hijackers, the Pentagon video evidence, which most of us have not seen yet, the evidence of the plane parts recovered by the FBI was not addressed, and the evidence regarding phone calls reportedly made from the planes was not addressed. So what the Lawyers Committee has done is we brought a lawsuit in Washington, D.C., and we're basically asking the federal court to order the FBI to go back to the drawing board and do what Congress ordered the FBI to do, which is to assess all of this evidence, report it to Congress, and thereby report it to us. That lawsuit is in the early stages. We did see a motion to dismiss from the FBI recently, but we amended our complaint, which is a right we have under the procedure, and so that motion got mooted, which means the government's going to refile it, and we'll keep you informed of what happens with that lawsuit. But it's essentially about the Lawyers Committee getting the FBI to do what Congress ordered. So we're actually trying to do Congress's job for it, and we hope the Congress appreciates our efforts in that regard. Now, a few days ago, we filed another federal lawsuit. And most of you probably know by now, I don't know, a year and a half ago, we filed a petition to the U.S. Attorney in New York. And this petition is under a federal statute, which some of you may know about and many of you may not. It's a statute that gives every citizen, every one of you, the right to report evidence of a federal crime to a U.S. attorney, and it mandates that the U.S. attorney, once they receive your evidence, actually deliver it to a federal special grand jury. It's not a discretionary duty, which means it's not an option. The U.S. attorney has to do it. So we did put the demolition evidence together in a lengthy petition, 50-some pages, 50-some exhibits, drawing heavily on the work of Richard Gage, Kevin Ryan, go down the list, and also heavily on the testimony of more than 100 firefighters and first responders. And for those who haven't read those testimonies, the New York Times acquired them from the state of New York through a Freedom of Information request and published them. They're still on the New York Times webpage. And those first-hand eyewitness reports of the firefighters and other first responders report the sights and sounds of explosions, which is very consistent with the other categories of scientific evidence we describe in our petition. And most of you know about that evidence at this point. It includes chemical analysis of the dust from the collapse of the buildings, which showed the presence of active nanothermite, vascular nanothermate. That evidence includes very high temperatures measured at ground zero on 9/11, temperatures well exceeding what jet fuel can create, well exceeding what building contents can create when they burn. And of course, you know by now from Richard Gage and Company, the near free fall, and David Chandler, the near free fall speed of collapse of Building 7 during part of its collapse and so forth. So The U.S. Attorney, somewhat to our surprise, sent us a letter after we submitted this petition and stated in writing that the U.S. Attorney will comply with the federal statute I mentioned to you, which requires the U.S. Attorney to submit the evidence to the special grand jury. Now, the U.S. Attorney did not elaborate on what steps would be taken to comply, so we don't actually know, notwithstanding that letter, whether our petition and all the evidence of demolition has been handed to the special grand jury. We called, David Meinswinkel, my colleague, and I called the Assistant United States Attorney, Michael Ferrara, who is the chief of the terrorism unit in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I asked him point blank, can you tell us what the status is of our petition? And he said because of the federal rule regarding secrecy of grand jury proceedings, he could not tell us anything more. So we still don't know what actually happened. And because of that, we filed this lawsuit a few days ago in New York. And the purpose of that lawsuit is to first get a disclosure from the U.S. Attorney, court-ordered disclosure, either of documents or information that will tell us for sure whether our petition and all the demolition evidence has been given to the special grand jury. If we don't get that disclosure for some technical reason, or if the disclosure shows that the U.S. Attorney did not hand the evidence to the grand jury, then the second part of our lawsuit is requesting a court order to direct the U.S. Attorney to do its duty, his duty, which is mandatory, and provide all that evidence to the grand jury. So we'll keep you informed as that lawsuit proceeds. It also, of course, is in the early stages. Now, as part of our petition to the U.S. Attorney of materials to be given to the grand jury, we've filed a few supplements to that petition after the original submission. Just the other day, we filed the resolution from the fire commissioners of Franklin Munson in New York. Most of you have probably seen that on the web by now. The fire commissioners of that district, including Commissioner Joya, voted to support the Lawyers Committee's petition to the U.S. Attorney. And that is a historic development. If you get a chance to, maybe send an email of support to the fire commissioners, do that. It took a little courage. Their first group of professional firefighters and commissioners to take that position publicly that I know of. And they did support our petition and supported a full grand jury investigation. And in doing so, they stated explicitly that they found the evidence submitted in the petition of demolition, use of explosives, to be highly persuasive. And these are experienced firefighters. As another supplement, and most of you have heard about this, the University of Alaska study that just came out from Professor Halsey, which concluded that the World Trade Center 7 building did not collapse due to fire, contrary to the official story, and that when it did collapse, it collapsed in a manner that had virtually all of the columns failing simultaneously or nearly simultaneously. And I think we all know there's only one method that can achieve that result. We also submitted a deposition. Many of you may not know about this. David Meinswinkel and I interviewed an operating engineer from New York with the union there, and this engineer testified under oath, and we have the transcript. I think it may be on our website by now if you want to see it. And he described another union person who worked in the Trade Center in the weeks prior to 9/11, and he reported to this operating engineer that there were these mystery crews that came in on Saturdays after midnight. They were not required to follow normal procedure. They did not sign in with security. They had no identification. They had no orders. The vehicle they drove in was unmarked. The engineers were told not to record their visit in the logbooks, and they were ordered to not monitor the work of these mystery crews. And I think most of you understand the potential significance of that type of an event given the evidence we've submitted on demolition as described by Richard Gage and others. So we did submit that transcript of that deposition to the U.S. Attorney's Office to be submitted to the grand jury. We also submitted a document you can find on our website in redacted form without the names, but we submitted a document we call persons with material information, or persons who may have material information. And our first filing, the petition, was about the crime, what crime happened, the use of explosives to bring the buildings down, which unfortunately caused dramatically increased loss of life from the incident. But the supplement we filed is about another part of the investigation, which has more to do with who may have been involved in committing the crime. And so that was also provided to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Now, some of the evidence we submitted is what I would call circumstantial evidence. It's not standing alone dispositive. It may be highly suggestive. But other categories of the demolition evidence is, in fact, dispositive from a scientific point of view and a legal point of view. Some of the categories of evidence, like the extreme temperatures, the free fall collapse speed for Building 7, the red gray chips with the thermite material, perhaps even the seismic evidence. There's no other way to explain the presence of those categories of evidence other than the use of explosives. And as Arthur Conan Doyle's famous character Sherlock Holmes has said, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And a lot of folks attempt to dismiss this evidence because it's hard to believe, and it sort of is hard to believe that someone would intentionally murder 3,000 people, including first responders, and plant explosives to bring down, two of the tallest buildings in the world. Yeah, that's hard to believe. It is improbable. The problem is the alternatives have been eliminated scientifically. So the improbable must be truth. In addition to those two lawsuits, we have 3 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits active in Washington, D.C. They all involve the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. One also involves FEMA. One is to acquire the building performance study data that FEMA used to do their study of the building collapses. Another one requests that NIST provide the interviews it did of witnesses at Ground Zero. And a third, which is closely related to the Halsey University of Alaska study, we're trying to get the column 79 data. Some of you know that NIST, in their attempt to explain away Building 7's collapse due to fire, that's their theory, did a model, a computer model, which they refused to make available for independent scientific inspection. And their explanation is the collapse started at column 79. But they won't give us the surrounding data to allow a peer review of their conclusions. So we're trying to get it through a lawsuit. The Freedom of Information Act has been very useful in the past, and we hope it will help us make some breakthroughs in the future. One of the interesting documents or records we obtained through the FOIA, and when I say we, in this case, it was my local Bloomington, Indiana group that I worked with before the Lawyers Committee. There was a document that shows that one of the alleged 9/11 hijackers submitted an application to renew his pilot's license and did a physical exam to get that license renewed. The interesting part of that document is it's dated after 9/11. Another interesting record that was obtained by David Cole's efforts, and David, many of you know David, has been investigating 9/11 and doing Freedom of Information Act requests for a long time. So he obtained this audio transcript, which is interesting. It's long, but it's interesting to listen to. And it's the actual live telephone calls that the FAA was doing on 9/11, trying to deal with events as they unfolded. And one of the interesting live conversations you can hear in this tape is the Secret Service reported to the FAA that a plane had crashed at Camp David. And then a few minutes later on the call, there is another report that the Secret Service confirms that a plane crashed at Camp David. Now, that's obviously not part of the official story, but it's kind of hard to imagine the Secret Service, which is not only a professionally trained organization, but they're bound by law to protect Camp David, among other places, not only making a mistake the first time that an airplane had crashed there, but confirming a second time that an airplane had crashed there. So I don't know what actually happened there. That's part of our ongoing investigation, but it shows you what you can learn through Freedom of Information requests, and we continue to pursue those. Now, David Meiswinkle and I, on a request that David did through the Pennsylvania state law, and most of you may not know that, or most of you may know that states have sort of similar laws to the federal. You can request public records from state governments as well. So we asked to see the coroner's records at the Shanksville site, near the Shanksville site, about the alleged crash there. And we did get a chance to review those records. We spent a couple days there. And one of the interesting documents we saw there, and there are several, was a court filing by the coroner, and the coroner was trying to get death certificates issued for the passengers, and he didn't have enough DNA or other physical evidence to identify a lot of the passengers at that time. And so he asked the court to issue the death certificates, but he told the court he didn't want death certificates for the alleged hijackers because the FBI told him that they may have been using false identities. And that is something the FBI hasn't explained since. So we're going to try to make the most of the Freedom of Information laws. Another one of our strategies is to conduct our own investigations in addition to relying on what's already been done by others. We're hoping to document a lot of the known evidence, and the deposition I told you about is an example of that. But we're also hoping to do comprehensive investigations regarding Shanksville, the Pentagon, and regarding potential government obstruction of justice. So we'll keep you informed as those investigations proceed. They are in progress. The only real conclusion the Lawyers Committee has made, because we feel like we've done enough of an investigation to draw firm conclusions, is about the demolition evidence. And we are firmly convinced, sorry to say, that explosives were used to bring the two Trade Center towers in Building 7 down on 9/11, killing a lot of innocent people, including heroic first responders. Many of you may remember that one of the firefighters had worked his way up pretty high in one of the towers, and there's a recording of him calling in saying, I'm up here, there are not that many fires, we can probably knock them down with a couple of hoses. And shortly thereafter, that building collapsed. So that is something that deserves some serious investigation, and is one of my personal motivations for trying to get to the bottom of this, because whoever detonated the explosives on those towers knew that when they did that, that those first responders were still in buildings trying to effect rescues. And it takes a certain kind of person to do something like that. So that's sort of the accountability part of what we're doing. The transparency part is getting all the truth out. The accountability part is holding the wrongdoers accountable, and we're going to stick with that until we get there. So the Lawyers Committee is what we call an evidence-based advocacy organization. We try not to go beyond the evidence. The problem is there's been a lot of secrecy, a lot of evidence withheld. We still don't have Pentagon videos, a number of other categories we're trying to get. So I would encourage you all to be patient with your colleagues and your fellow investigators, even when you disagree on what theory best explains the evidence we do have, because we don't have all the evidence yet. And I think there is room for legitimate disagreement on competing hypotheses and theories. It's more important that we maintain some, what would be the word, unity, because our opponents have been using the divide and conquer strategy for some time now, and they've been playing sort of a sophisticated version of, I don't know if you remember the old Risk board game, or sort of a three-dimensional chess game, and most of us didn't even know we were in a game until more recently, and we probably started out playing checkers, and now we're starting to play chess. So be patient and listen to the folks who have competing theories. There may be valuable components of each theory that may help us get to the truth and help us maintain our unity. So another one of our strategies, which is just evolving, is we hope to develop collaboration with intelligence professionals and whistleblowers. William Binney is one of those folks who used to work with the NSA, and we'll tell you more about that as it develops. We're also hoping at some point to engage in congressional education and encourage congressional investigations. Our initial effort is to focus on litigation using the judicial system and also the FOIA, the Freedom of Information, using the executive branch. But if those efforts are, how shall I say, result in continued obstruction, we then will go to the third branch, legislative branch, and ask them to exercise their oversight authority over the first two branches for their failures to deal with this issue effectively. I'm trying to cut to the chase here so I don't use up too much time. So one thing to keep in mind is, if you accept, as I now do and my colleagues do, that the evidence of demolition is persuasive and dispositive, then where does that leave us? Well, one place it leaves us is that there have to be other perpetrators out there, even if you accept the part of the official story, which we're still investigating, but even if you accept that part about the alleged hijackers being who they were said to be, the hijackers were not the people who placed explosives in the buildings. And why do I say that with conviction? Well, think about it. If you're the hijackers and you've already placed explosives in the towers sufficient to completely destroy those buildings, and we've seen how completely they were destroyed, why waste the lives of your hijackers and these airplanes, which are hard to come by, that you've successfully hijacked, on the same targets you already know you're going to completely destroy? Why not go to other priority targets with those very scarce resources from a terrorist point of view? So there's no real reasonable possibility that the alleged hijackers who allegedly died in the crashes were the people who put these explosives in the buildings. It had to be other folks. And those folks are still out there. And they're still free to commit another crime of this type. And if someone asks you why is 9/11 still a live issue, and there are a number of good answers to that, including the ongoing war on terror, costing so much money and so many lives. But this is another one, that the real perpetrators of most of the murders have yet to be brought to justice and are free to commit another crime. And that needs to be stopped. So we've been warned by at least a couple presidents. President Eisenhower warned us that we need to be concerned about the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex, and President Kennedy about a similar concern about rogue intelligence agencies. So we need to, we have a sort of a deep state corruption problem here we need to come to grips with. 9/11 is a sign and symptom of that, a very important one, and maybe an opportunity for us to get to a way of exposing it. And I think that's going to be up to us. It's not up to a small group of lawyers or even a small group of scientists. It's up to us collectively. And some folks might question whether we have any real hope of succeeding in this. I think we are making progress. And this is not a Rambo type of thing. It's a Margaret Mead type of thing. And you may remember Margaret Mead said that never doubt that a small group of dedicated people can bring about positive social change. Indeed, that's the only way it's ever been done. I'm paraphrasing. And I think that's where we're at. So, you know, I think the movement started out as a few small groups, and David Ray Griffin obviously was one of those folks who helped initiate the movement. It's probably now millions of people, and what we need to do is find ways to maximize our unity and our effectiveness. And if we do that, we may be on the verge of a breakthrough. And again, thank you for inviting us. Hi, Mick. I'm Peter.
Hey, pleasure.
Nice job. Thank you. Let's hear it for Mick Harrison, the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Good evening. I'm Peter B. Collins. This is not my first 9/11 Truth Film Festival. I see a lot of familiar faces here, and I appreciate that you continue to search for the truth, to express your skepticism, and to find some community with others who share the same concerns. I'm a radio host. You may have heard me on different stations here, KGO, KNBR, KSFO. I host a podcast now that you can find at any time at peterbcollins.com. I've spent hundreds of hours, like many of you here, investigating 9/11, read all of David Ray Griffin's books, watched hours of documentary film. I personally witnessed the whitewash of the 9/11 Commission. At my own expense, I went to Washington. I was there in the room when Rumsfeld, who was celebrated as a hero in the Washington Post today, came in and he purposely ran down the clock as Richard Ben-Veniste asked him, "Did you order planes scrambled to protect the Pentagon on 9/11? And Rumsfeld, in his cocky manner, kind of looked around and said, "Did I order jets scrambled 9/11? Protect the Pentagon?" And then, as he expected, Governor Kean dropped his gavel and said, "Next question." So one of the people who I think has brought scientific rigor and professional standards to the investigation of the events of September 11th is Richard Gage, founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. His determination and persistence. We'll talk about the bright side. His wife left him because he was so determined to find the truth, and this summer he remarried and shared that great moment with many of us online. But Richard Gage connected with the engineering department at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, and over the last 4 years, they've been specifically focused on Building 7 and on confirming or contradicting the NIST report that claimed that the fires that didn't rise above the 13th floor in a 40-plus story building led to its collapse in its own footprint in less than 10 seconds at 5:20 in the afternoon, 20 minutes after the BBC had reported that the building had come down. I want to highlight for you, and if you go to ae911truth.org, you'll find the documents. I have a few quotes from the draft report that is available for your comments on the internet. It presents the findings and conclusions of a 4-year study of the collapse of Building 7, a 47-story building that suffered a total collapse at 5:20 p.m. on September 11. This study was conducted by a 3-person team at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, with funding provided by AE 9/11 Truth. According to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, the collapse of Building 7 was the first known instance of the total collapse of a tall building, primarily due to fires.
However, many independent researchers have studied the collapse and assembled a body of evidence that raises questions about the NIST conclusions. The objective of this study was threefold: examine the structural response of Building 7 to fire loads, rule out scenarios that could not have caused the observed collapse, and identify types of failures and their locations that may have caused the total collapse to observe. The principal conclusion of our study is that fire did not cause the collapse of WTC7 on 9/11, contrary to the conclusions of NIST and private engineering firms that studied the collapse. This is based on a number of findings from different analyses. Together, they show that fires could not have caused weakening or displacement of structural members capable of initiating any of the hypothetical local failures alleged to have triggered the total collapse of the building. Nor could any local failures, even if they had occurred, have triggered a sequence of failures that would have resulted in the observed total collapse. And here's the real blockbuster conclusion. The secondary conclusion of our study is that the collapse of WTC7 was a global failure involving the near simultaneous failure of every column in the building. Now, indulge me as I scratch my bald head and ask, what could this possibly mean? Strong winds? Some sort of a vortex? Well, I apologize to the dead for being facetious and injecting humor. But as I read this, there's only one way to interpret it: that the building was demolished, that it was detonated to cause the failures, the near simultaneous failure of every column in the building. So the study goes into more detail. I encourage you to read it. And I just want to cite the final part of the executive summary. The simultaneous failure of all core columns over 8 stories, followed 1.3 seconds later by the simultaneous failure of all exterior columns over 8 stories, produces almost exactly the behavior observed in the videos of the collapse. The collapse could have started at floor 16 and below and produced the same behavior. It is our conclusion, based upon these findings, that the collapse of Building 7 was a global failure involving the near simultaneous failure of all columns in the building, and not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns throughout the building. So the IHOP concept, the pancake, is excluded. Another development that many of you are probably aware of, that I want to share with the audience here this evening, is that a suburban New York City fire department, known as the Franklin Square and Munson Fire District, lost one of its members who responded on 9/11. His name is Thomas J. Hetzel. And this summer, the board of the fire district passed a resolution Let's hear it for this little fire district and the courage that they're showing. You guys ready? Yeah. Okay, I have a couple of minutes. I'd like to recommend that in the next day or two, you visit mintpressnews.org. Mint Press News. They have a very talented journalist there named Whitney Webb. She just completed a 4-part series about Jeffrey Epstein that is fascinating and goes so much deeper into his ties to the intelligence community than you'll find in any corporate media reporting. And today, she had a piece about 9/11, and she directly took on those who criticize and denounce skeptics as conspiracy theorists, tin-foil hat wearing. I mean, I've been called all of these names. And I'm proud that there are so many of us who have the courage to think independently, to think critically, and to stand up and say, wait a minute, I smell bullshit. And when people accuse you of being a conspiracy theorist, promoting conspiracy theories, well, one response that I believe, that I attribute anyway to David Ray Griffin, is, well, we know there was a conspiracy. We're trying to identify the right one. But the other way that I look at this, at least in the role that I think I have, my job is to expose cover-ups. I started on radio in the 1970s. Nixon was in office. Watergate was unraveling. One of my first big stories after Watergate was COINTELPRO. I was hosting a late-night radio show in Chicago. I met the lawyers and the survivors of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther who was murdered by Chicago police under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. And I played a small part in exposing COINTELPRO, and we thought we had controlled that virus, if not eliminated it. And after 9/11, they revived it in ways that even I couldn't have imagined, driven by the new technology and the surveillance tools, including self-reporting that we do with our cell phones and our Facebook posts. And so I ask you to think about this. And my determination is to blast through the cover-up. And like many people, I had original views about the Pentagon, and I've been persuaded that my initial perceptions were probably wrong. And I think as a movement and as individuals, we have to be rigorous, we have to be intellectually honest, and we must follow the evidence. In many places, the evidence is inconclusive because of a successful cover-up. And my final comment here, and I think somebody's ready to take over in a second, is if you haven't already, I recommend that you read David Talbot's fabulous book called The Devil's Chessboard. And you will learn, if you haven't already, that we have been lied to by our intelligence community since the passage of the National Intelligence Act and the National Surveillance Acts in 1947. It has been consistent, relentless, lie piled on lie. Those who fought for the truth marginalized, sometimes dead in a bathtub. And we have an intelligence community that continues to rule the roost control the media, and produce the most recent episode of psychological operation visited on the American people called Russiagate. And so I encourage you to remain vigilant, sniff out cover-ups, do what you can to expose them, and wear your tinfoil hat with pride.